"Tell me," the empress said, her voice like cold water poured into crystal, "why I should let a human woman speak in my court." Lyra did not flinch. She had trained herself not to flinch in the presence of the Veilesi, whose every silence carried the weight of a species that had been ruling star systems when humanity was still arguing over who owned which river. She stood on the obsidian floor of the constellation chamber, a vast, domed hall aboard the imperial carrier Ascendance, where the vaulted ceiling displayed a live projection of the stars outside the hull, and every footstep echoed against stone quarried from the Veilesi homeworld and carried across 6 systems. And she kept her hands still at her sides and her chin level and her breathing steady. "Because, your radiance," she said, "no one else in this chamber knows who is stealing from you." The empress's name was Savithra. She was tall, all Veilesi were tall, but Savithra was tall even by their standards. 7 feet of narrow-boned elegance wrapped in layered ceremonial silks the color of deep-sea ice. Her skin was the cool lavender gray of the imperial bloodline, luminous under the constellation light, and her eyes were dark amber set in wide, angular sockets that gave her face the quality of something carved rather than born. Her pointed ears rose through her hair like blades sheathed in silk. Her hair itself was black-violet, worn in a single intricate braid that fell to her waist and was threaded with thin filaments of white gold that caught the starlight and held it. She looked at Lyra the way you look at a stain on a document you were about to sign, not angry, not alarmed, just faintly inconvenienced by something that should not be there. "You are the human attache," she said, "not a question, a classification." "I am Lyra Voss, Terran Diplomatic Auxiliary, assigned to this vessel 8 months ago as part of the species exchange program that my predecessor considered a courtesy and that I consider a waste of deck space." She had read the file. That was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and in Veilesi courts the distinction was often cosmetic. "Your file says you were a forensic auditor on Earth before the exchange program recruited you. It says you are competent with numbers and unremarkable in every other respect." "The file is accurate on the first count," Lyra said. Something shifted in the empress's amber eyes, a flicker, not of amusement, but of the thing that comes just before amusement in people who have forgotten how to be amused. She did not smile. Veilesi empresses did not smile at human attaches. They smiled at victories, at the completion of centuries-long strategies, and occasionally at the deaths of people who had underestimated them. "Speak," she said. Lyra had rehearsed this moment for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of quiet, solitary work in the financial archives that no one in the Empress's court considered important enough to guard, because no one believed a human was capable of reading Veilesi accounting notation, which had been true when she arrived. She had taught herself. Long nights in her quarters with a language primer stolen from the education annex, and a growing certainty that the numbers she was finding did not add up, and that the gap between what the Ascendance's treasury reported and what it actually held was not an error but a theft, and that the theft was not small. "Your treasury is being drained," she said, "systematically. Over the last 14 months, approximately 900 million standard units have been diverted through cascading subaccounts routed through the naval procurement system. The diversions are disguised as maintenance expenditures for the carrier's secondary hull systems, systems that exist on paper but have not been physically present on this vessel since the refit 6 years ago." The chamber went silent, not the comfortable silence of a court between conversations, but the hard silence of a room in which someone has said something that cannot be unsaid. Savithra's advisor, a thin Veilesi male named Korath who stood at her left shoulder like a decorative column with opinions, made a sound, a soft exhalation. He was the keeper of the imperial ledger, responsible for the financial systems Lyra had just accused of hemorrhaging money. His skin was darker than the Empress's, the slate gray of the administrative caste, and his eyes were a flat, reflective black that gave nothing away. "These are serious allegations," Korath said. His voice was measured, the voice of someone who has spent decades learning to sound reasonable under pressure. From a human attache with no standing in this court and no authority to access treasury records. I access the procurement archives, Lyra said. They are classified as administrative, not financial. The distinction is in your own filing protocols. Korath's jaw tightened. She had been watching him for 4 weeks, ever since the trail of numbers led from the phantom hull systems to the procurement office to a series of authorization codes bearing the signature pattern of someone with keeper-level access. The keeper's office administers the procurement system, she continued, keeping her eyes on the empress rather than Korath, because the first rule of Valesi court politics was that you spoke to the throne, not to the people standing next to it. Every diverted transaction carries an authorization signature consistent with keeper-level credentials. I am not accusing anyone in this chamber. I am presenting a forensic finding. You are presenting speculation, Korath said. Dressed in numbers, you do not have the cultural context to interpret. The numbers are not culturally relative, Lyra said. 900 million units is 900 million units in any language. The empress raised one hand, fingers barely lifted from the arm of her throne, but the room stopped. Korath stopped. The 6 other advisors in their half-circle of carved stone seats stopped. The 2 imperial guards flanking the entrance stopped breathing loudly enough for Lyra to hear. Continue, Savithra said. The diversions are not going to an external account. They are being cycled back into the Ascendance's own systems through a secondary treasury node that reports to the keeper's office, but is not included in the standard audit cycle. The money is not being stolen from the ship. It is being hidden within the ship. Another silence. Lyra could feel Korath's attention like a physical pressure, not looking at her, because looking would be an admission that what she was saying mattered, but attending to her with every fiber of his angular body. Why? The empress asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. That single word told Lyra more about Savithra than her entire file. She was not merely a figurehead wearing her predecessor's silks, but someone who wanted to understand the architecture of her own empire. I don't know yet, Lyra said, but the pattern suggests preparation. Someone is building a reserve fund inside your own vessel, hidden from your own auditors, large enough to finance a significant operation. The question is not where the money is going. The question is what it is being saved for. She paused. The next part was where she stopped being a curiosity and started being a threat. I can find out, if you give me access to the secondary treasury node and 7 days. The breach had appeared on a Tuesday. Corin used the word anyway, though it had no meaning on a world with a 37-hour rotation, because there was something anchoring about marking time in the old way when everything else was becoming unmoored. He had been running his morning survey along the dorsal crest, the highest point of exposed hull, where the black alloy met the canyon's sedimentary walls, when his hand scanner registered an atmospheric discontinuity. A pocket of warm air, seeping from the hull's surface at a point where, the previous day, the surface had been continuous and sealed. He had knelt, pressed his palm flat against the alloy, a habit, not a protocol, the tactile verification of a man who trusted his hands as much as his instruments, and felt what his instruments confirmed. A seam, hairline thin, barely perceptible under his fingertips, running in a clean 2-meter line along the dorsal crest. By the time Dr. Tenek reached the site 40 minutes later, the seam had widened to 1 centimeter. The hull plating was separating. Not cracking, separating. The 2 sections drawing apart with the smooth, unhurried precision of a door that had been designed to open this way, and was now, after 500,000 years, executing its design. By midday, the breach was complete. A wound 2 meters long and 1 meter wide, the edges clean, the metal folded back like the pages of a book open to a particular chapter. No heat residue, no stress fractures, no evidence of force. warm air rising from the interior, carrying a scent that none of the dig team could identify, not unpleasant, not chemical, something organic and faintly sweet, like the memory of soil after rain in a place that had not seen rain in geological time. Rast had called it spontaneous fracture due to thermal cycling. Tenek had accepted the assessment for the official report. Corin had nodded and filed his own observations silently. The edges of the breach were not fractured. They were folded, with the same submolecular precision as the glyphs. The ship had not broken. It had opened. And in the 6 days since, while the team debated safety protocols, rigged harness lines, ran atmospheric analyses, and transmitted reports to the regional office requesting a hazard assessment team that would take 3 weeks to arrive, Corin had stood at that opening every morning and every evening, feeling the warm air on his face, watching the pale canyon daylight slide into the dark interior and illuminate nothing, and knowing, not suspecting, not hypothesizing. Knowing in the place below hypothesis where pattern recognition lived and where 23 years of field instinct had their roots, that the ship had opened for a reason, and that the reason was standing at the rim, waiting for the courage to descend. This morning, before the team's briefing, before the canyon daylight had fully reached the excavation floor, he had clipped into a harness, checked his wrist unit, said nothing to anyone, and dropped through the breach into the oldest air he had ever breathed. Now he followed the glyph lines deeper into the hold, and the ship followed him back. Every step he took, the deck responded. Glyph channels ignited ahead of him, not as though anticipating his path. He tested this by stopping twice, changing direction, doubling back, and each time the light recalibrated to his new position. But as though his presence was the input the system required, and wherever that input moved, the system tracked it. The pattern on the deck was not a road. It was a nervous system, and his footsteps were the stimulus. The interior was vast. His headlamp could not find the far wall. The ceiling arched overhead at a height of perhaps 20 meters, supported by ribbed structural members that curved like the bones of a chest cavity, and the glyph lines ran along the floor in branching patterns that grew denser as he moved forward. Behind him, the path he had walked was a web of warm gold light traced across the black deck, and the breach was a pale rectangle of canyon daylight framed by a luminous map of his own passage. The air around him, breathable, stable, a steady 19 degrees despite the canyon exterior sitting at 4 below zero, was being maintained, actively, for something that every instrument in the compact's inventory had declared inert, powerless, and dead. The ship was doing a thorough impression of a living system that had simply been holding its breath. At 40 meters from the breach, he found the first secondary chamber, a doorway on the starboard side, its edges marked by raised glyphs that had ignited when he approached and now cast amber light into a room the size of a small auditorium. Inside, arrayed on low platforms of the black alloy, were objects, dozens of them. Spheres, cubes, irregular polyhedra, each one made of different materials, stone, crystal, something that looked like compacted volcanic ash, something that might have been fossilized wood, and each one carved with glyphs. The same glyph system, the same hand, the same chisel depth ratio that he had measured on 7 monoliths and 12,000 hull markings. He did not enter. The archaeologist's reflex pulled at him, the hunger to catalog, to measure, to understand, but the main glyph channel on the deck ran past the doorway, not into it, and something in the pattern's behavior suggested that the secondary chambers were not the destination. They were inventory. The ship had been sealed with everything inside it, and everything inside it had been preserved for 500,000 years in an atmosphere so carefully maintained that the objects on the platforms showed no degradation, no corrosion, no dust. A library, packed for a journey whose duration the builders had measured in geological epochs. He kept walking. Each step ignited new channels. Each new channel deepened the web of gold behind him. At 60 meters, a second chamber. This one contained what looked like workstation surfaces at standing height, embedded with channels that matched the deck patterns, surrounded by curved screens of translucent material that might have been crystal or might have been something the compact had no classification for. The screens were dark. The channels were not lit. The room had the quality of a place that was ready but not active, a system waiting for an operator, the way a console waits for hands. At 75 meters, the glyph channels on the deck began to pulse. Not the steady luminescence he had been following, but a rhythmic brightening and dimming, once per second, slow, measured, like a heartbeat heard from a long way off. The pulse pattern ran ahead of him, toward whatever the main channel was leading to, and the ship's ambient hum shifted, deepened, gained a harmonic overtone that Corin felt less in his ears and more in the flat bones of his sternum. The ship knew he was close. At 80 meters, a third chamber, and this one stopped him in the doorway. It was small, perhaps 5 meters square. The walls were lined with panels of the translucent material, and behind the panels, visible through the crystal the way objects are visible through clear ice, were shapes. A hand tool, long-handled, blade curved, designed for a grip he recognized. A garment folded into a precise rectangle, its fabric a deep indigo that had not faded in 500 millennia. A pair of boots, thick-soled, worn at the heel, sized for a human foot. And on the rear wall, mounted at eye height, a flat panel of the black alloy into which a single image had been carved in relief. A figure standing, arms at its sides, palms forward, face lifted. Human proportions, human posture, human in every ratio and joint and angle. The face was generic, not a portrait but a type, the way a symbol on a door indicates male or female without specifying which male, which female. Human, just human. Carved into the wall of a ship buried for 500,000 years on a world where no human had set foot, until the compact's survey drones passed through 16 centuries ago. The carving's palms forward posture was not a surrender. It was an offering. Corin had seen it on 2 of the frontier monoliths, the same stance, carved into stone 500,000 years old, facing outward as though greeting someone who had not yet arrived. He had catalogued it as a reception figure in his field notes and moved on. Now, standing 3 meters from the same gesture rendered in the wall of a ship that was waking around him, he understood what it was. A welcome, placed here by builders who had known that the person it was meant for would not arrive for a very long time, and had wanted them to know, when they finally did, that they were expected. He memorized the chamber's contents, the tool, the garment, the boots, the figure, and kept walking, because the glyph channel's pulse was growing stronger, and the ship's hum had gained a second harmonic, and the air in the hold carried a warmth now that had nothing to do with temperature control and everything to do with proximity to something that had been patient for longer than patience should be possible. Someone was collecting those salary allocations and routing them into the same secondary treasury node. The procurement theft was the second phase. The ghost workforce was the foundation. That night, a maintenance drone malfunctioned outside her quarters. It struck the door hard enough to dent the frame before resuming its route. The malfunction was logged as a sensor glitch. The drone's last diagnostic showed a manual override input from a terminal in the communications oversight office. 2 incidents, the archive break-in and the drone, both designed to look accidental, both originating from the same part of the ship. The 4th day, she found the connection to the military. The ghost workforce's salary allocations corresponded, not exactly, but with a statistical correlation that made coincidence impossible, to cost projections for a fleet upgrade program the previous empress had proposed and quietly shelved 2 years before her death. A program to refit the Ascendance's secondary weapon systems, with targeting arrays, that would give the carrier independent strike capability against planetary targets. Someone was secretly funding a weapons program the previous empress had chosen not to pursue. Hiding money inside the Ascendants to build weapons the current empress had not authorized. That same day, she found the power consumption anomaly. A section of the lower decks, officially sealed storage, was drawing 3 times the energy of comparable sections. The procurement records for raw materials matched specifications for targeting array housing components. The weapons program was already in production. Lyra sat in the archive room at the end of the 4th day with the full scope of the conspiracy spread across 4 data tablets arranged in a semicircle on her desk, and she allowed herself 60 seconds to feel the weight of it. The number she kept coming back to was not 900 million units. That was abstract, a figure too large to feel. The number that landed was 14. 14 months of diversions. 14 months during which the Empress had held audiences, issued orders, governed an empire, and slept aboard a vessel that was being hollowed out beneath her. 14 months during which someone had been building the means to remove her, using her own treasury to fund it, and the only person who had noticed was a human forensic auditor who was supposed to be filing cultural exchange reports that no one read. She thought about the word unremarkable in her personnel file. She thought about what it meant to be unremarkable in a system that was designed to overlook you. How the thing they used to dismiss you was the same thing that gave you access, and how the access was worth more than the respect, because the respect could be revoked but the knowledge, once gathered, was permanent. She gave herself the 60 seconds, then she went back to work. That evening, she cross-referenced the Ghost workforce roster against the Ascendance's actual crew manifest for a 3rd time, looking for the pattern she could feel but had not yet articulated. It came to her at 2100 hours between one data tablet and the next. The Phantom crew members were not randomly distributed across departments. They were clustered. 62% were listed in engineering, 23% in logistics, the remaining 15% in communications. Engineering, logistics, communications, the 3 departments you would need to control if you were building an unauthorized weapons system in the lower decks, engineering to fabricate the components, logistics to move the materials, communications to ensure no one heard the noise. The Ghost workforce was not just a funding mechanism. It was a staffing chart, the organizational blueprint for the weapons program, hidden in plain sight inside the payroll system. Whoever had built it had designed an entire parallel operation, complete with departmental structure and resource allocation, embedded so deeply in the carrier's legitimate systems that separating the two would require dismantling parts of the administration itself. The elegance of it was almost admirable. Almost. Lyra had spent enough time studying financial crime to appreciate craftsmanship without respecting it. A beautiful lie was still a lie, and this one had a body count. The 4th night, the junior clerk from Koreth's office was found unconscious in a maintenance corridor with a head wound. The medical report said he had slipped on a wet surface. The maintenance logs showed no cleaning scheduled. The humidity controls for that section had been adjusted 4 minutes before the clerk's estimated time of injury, from the same terminal in the communications oversight office. 3 incidents, same origin, escalating. Someone was systematically removing anyone connected to Lyra's investigation. She went to the Empress that night, a day early. Savithra received her in the private study, a smaller chamber lined with star charts on crystalline panels glowing blue-white. She was alone with a data tablet, which she set down with the precision of someone who does not like interruption, but has decided to permit it. "You have 3 days remaining," she said. "I have enough." Lyra told her everything: the Phantom maintenance, the Ghost workforce, the 3-year buildup, the weapons program, the power anomaly, the manufacturing facility, the break-in, the drone, the clerk's arranged accident, the terminal in the communications oversight office. She laid it out the way she had been trained: facts first, connections second, implications last. Savithra listened without interrupting. Her face changed in ways so small and precisely controlled that reading them required the attention Lyra had spent 8 months developing. A slight tightening around her eyes at the ghost workforce. A fractional shift in her jaw at the weapons program. A stillness, not calm, but the stillness of someone holding something very large very carefully. When Lyra reached the implications. Someone on this vessel is building an independent military capability inside your own carrier, using your own treasury, without your authorization. The scale suggests they are not acting alone. The duration suggests they have been planning this longer than you have been Empress, and they have begun eliminating anyone who connects the financial trail to its source. Lyra stopped. She had been speaking for 11 minutes. In that time, she had dismantled the Empress's understanding of her own ship, her own treasury, and her own court. Savithra was quiet for a long time. The star charts painted her lavender-gray skin in silver and ice, and her amber eyes held a quality Lyra had not seen before, the specific, surgical clarity of someone who has just been shown the shape of the knife aimed at their back. Korath, she said, one word. The institutional codes originate from his office, but the operation predates his appointment by 18 months. Either he inherited it and continued it, or he inherited it and did not notice it, or someone placed it in his systems deliberately, to ensure that when the trail was followed, it would lead to him. Lyra nodded. Savithra was faster than her file suggested. Her intelligence was not academic, it was architectural. She saw structures, connections, the way forces moved through systems. I know who benefits, Savithra said. Her voice was quiet, not soft, but weighted. The kind of quiet that precedes decisions that rearrange the world. She stood and walked to the far wall, the star chart of the Valesi home system. She stood there for a moment with her back to Lyra, one hand resting on the panel beside the chart, fingers splayed against the glass as if she could feel the gravitational pull of those 7 planets through the rendering. I inherited this ship, she said, still facing the chart. I inherited this court. I inherited this war, this treasury, this crew. I inherited the silks I am wearing and the throne I sit on and the title that makes people stop breathing when I raise my hand. I inherited all of it, and for 2 years I have governed it, and for 2 years I have known, felt, suspected, sensed without proof, that something inside it was wrong. Something I could not name. Something that moved in the spaces between the systems I inherited, using the architecture I was given against the purposes I was trying to serve. She turned back to Lyra. Her amber eyes held the blue-white light of the star chart, and in that light they looked ancient and young at the same time. The eyes of someone who carried centuries of lineage and 2 years of grief, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting an enemy she could not see. You named it, she said. In 5 days, you named the thing I have been trying to find for 2 years. I had the advantage of not inheriting anything, Lyra said. Fresh eyes see what familiar ones have learned to accept. I need to tell you something. She did not return to her throne. She sat in the reading chair, smaller, unadorned, the kind you sit in when you are being a person rather than a position. She gestured to the chair opposite. Lyra sat. My predecessor was my mother. She did not die of the wasting illness the official record describes. She was poisoned, slowly, over a year, by someone with access to her private chambers. The poison was derived from a mineral found only in the Ascendance's deep hull, the same hull sections where your phantom maintenance expenditures are concentrated. The room tilted, not physically, but in the way a picture tilts when you realize you have been looking at it from the wrong angle. I have known this for 2 years, Savithra continued. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands, folded in her lap, were pressed together hard enough to whiten the joints. I have been unable to prove it. The medical records were altered, the toxicology samples lost. Every path led to a wall built from the silence of people who knew and chose not to speak. And now I have given you a different path, Lyra said. You have given me the architecture. The financial architecture of a conspiracy that poisoned my mother, stole my treasury, and is building weapons inside my own ship to ensure that when they move against me, they will not need poison. They will take the ship. Lyra sat with the weight. Not fear, not yet, but the cold awareness of standing at the edge of something that could not be stepped back from. The people behind this will know you know the moment you act, she said. Yes. You need to move first. Yes. I can help. Savithra looked at her, and Lyra saw recognition, not gratitude, which did not translate cleanly into Veilesi emotional architecture, but the weighted recognition of one person seeing another clearly. Not as a function, not as a species, as someone whose actions had earned the right to be seen. You understand that helping me makes you a target. I understand. If we fail, your government will not protect you. I have been alone on this ship for 8 months. I know what alone looks like. If we succeed, the cost will not be small. The court will fracture, and you, a human, an outsider, will be the one who fractured it. I did not come to this ship to be unremarkable, Lyra said. For the first time since they had met, Savithra smiled. Not a victory smile or a political smile. A real smile, small, brief, startled out of her. It lasted less than 2 seconds and changed the topography of her face entirely, turning carved stone into something warmer than she would have been comfortable knowing. Then we begin tonight, she said. Savithra had allies. Not many, but the right ones. Commander Davrath, who ran the security detachment and had served under her mother and carried his loyalty like a scar that never healed. Thesson, who had been quietly terrified for 3 months. And Lyra, the human attache, the afterthought with the numbers. Her role was specific. Build the case for the imperial conclave, the assembly of senior advisors and military commanders with the authority to order an internal investigation. The conclave had not been convened in 9 years. Convening it was, in Veilesi political terms, the equivalent of pulling a fire alarm in a building that had been telling itself for a decade that it was not on fire. The night before the conclave, Thesson came to her again. She was pale even by Veilesi standards, and her hands were shaking. Someone has accessed my personal workstation. After hours, they copied my activity logs for 3 months. They know I have been watching the authorization anomalies. When? Last night, the access was masked, routed through maintenance to look like a diagnostic, but I know what masked access looks like. Where did the access originate? The Communications Oversight Office. The circle was tightening. Whoever was running this operation was accelerating. Stay in the human auxiliary section tonight, Lyra told her. My quarters. No one watches the human quarters. Thesson stayed. She slept on the floor, wrapped in a thermal blanket rated for Veilesi physiology that was too warm for Lyra and too cold for her, and she did not sleep well. But she was alive in the morning, which was the only metric that mattered. Before the conclave, Lyra needed the final piece, the one she had not told Savithra about. The oldest transactions in the operation did not match Korath's institutional codes. They matched a code pattern decommissioned 2 years ago, when the previous empress died. They were the old empress's personal codes, used after her death by someone who had retained access. 4 people had held that access, the old empress dead, Korath, Davrath, and Areth, the old empress's personal physician, who had administered daily medical protocols and held biometric override. She went to Davrath. His security operations center was a low-ceilinged room filled with monitoring equipment. He was tall for a Veilesi, broad-shouldered, deep lines around dark silver eyes, and a jaw suggesting permanent vigilance. Commander, I need to ask about the old Empress's personal authorization codes. His hands went still on the console. Why? Someone used them after her death to initiate the first phase of the financial operation. A silence, not a Veilesi silence, but a human silence. The silence of someone who has been carrying a suspicion, and has just heard it spoken by someone else. 3 people had access, he said, the Empress Korath, and Arith her physician, not Savithra. The heir did not have access to the sovereign's personal codes, security protocol older than this carrier. Where is Arith? Dead 7 months after the old Empress. Shuttle malfunction. The investigation found mechanical failure. And you believe that? I have not believed anything about that shuttle for 2 years. He stood and walked to the small viewport showing the void outside, stars scattered across the black like salt on a dark table. The old Empress was not just my sovereign. She was the reason I stayed in service past retirement. She saw the Ascendants as more than a weapon, as a home, for all the species aboard. When she died, something in this ship died with her. I have spent 2 years trying to identify what is growing in the space, where that something used to be. He turned back to Lyra with the expression of a man who has decided something. I have been conducting my own investigation, he said, quietly, without authorization, without telling the Empress, because I did not have proof, and because accusing a member of the advisory council without proof would have ended my career and left Savithra without the one person in the security apparatus who was actually looking. He exhaled, a heavy sound, weighted with 2 years of solitary vigilance. The shuttle's maintenance records were accessed 3 hours before departure, from a terminal in the senior officer's quarters. I traced the terminal but not the user. The surveillance logs were selectively corrupted. A 12-minute window removed. Someone with authority over the surveillance system. Yes. Counselor Erath, Lyra said. She oversees the carrier's communications and surveillance networks. She was the old Empress's closest ally, first to support Savithra's succession, and the most vocal advocate for increased military spending, specifically for the weapons systems the financial trail leads to. Erath. Lyra had seen her in the Constellation Chamber, a tall, composed Valesi woman with silver-streaked black hair and the stillness of someone who has spent decades being the quietest person in any room. She had not spoken during Lyra's presentation. She had watched with brushed steel eyes and an expression that gave away nothing. I need the personnel transfer logs from the month Arith died, Lyra said. Davrith studied her, a Valesi security commander measuring a human forensic auditor. Then he pulled up the logs and stepped aside. The shuttle's navigational data had been altered through a routing update from a terminal in the Communications Oversight Office. The update changed the approach vector by 2 degrees, enough to intersect a debris field the standard route avoided. A 2-degree correction, invisible unless you were looking. 2 degrees. Lyra turned the number over in her mind as she walked back to the archive room through corridors that were empty at this hour, the carrier's lighting dimmed to its night cycle amber. 2 degrees was nothing, a rounding error in most navigational contexts, a deviation so small it would not register on a standard flight review. And yet 2 degrees, applied at the right point in a trajectory, was enough to kill. The mathematics of murder by negligible adjustment, the same principle that governed the financial diversions, each transaction too small to trigger review, devastating in aggregate. The same mind, the same patience, the same profound confidence in the power of small, invisible changes. She was beginning to understand Erath. Not sympathize. Understanding and sympathy occupied different rooms in Lyra's mind, and she kept the doors between them firmly closed. But understand, yes. Erath was a systems thinker. She did not overpower systems, she redirected them. A 2-degree adjustment here, a reclassified filing protocol there, a phantom maintenance expenditure, a ghost crew member, a corrupted surveillance log, each one invisible. Each one a thread in a web that only became visible when you pulled far enough back to see the whole pattern. Lyra had pulled far enough back, and the pattern was a coup. At 300, she sat in the archive room with the complete picture assembled around her. Arith had been the instrument, the physician who poisoned the old Empress, who used her codes to build the financial foundation, who was then killed to sever the connection. Korath's systems had been compromised for institutional cover. And behind it all, Counselor Erath, the quietest person in the room, the old empress's trusted ally, who had supported Savithra's succession because a young, untested empress was easier to maneuver around. Erath was building weapons to take the ship for herself. She would let Korath take the blame, the same way she had let Arath take the risk before eliminating him. Lyra was afraid, not of the conclave, not of Erath. She was afraid because she understood, with the clarity that comes at 300, that presenting this evidence would put her at the center of the fracture. A human woman who had walked into a Valesi conspiracy and dismantled it, who would spend the rest of her life either celebrated or hunted. She had wanted to be useful. She had wanted to be seen. She had not fully considered what being seen would cost. But she thought of Savithra's hands pressed together hard enough to whiten the joints while she spoke about her mother, and the clerk in the corridor with a wound that was not an accident, and Arath in a shuttle with a 2-degree deviation no one had caught for 2 years. And she decided the cost was worth paying. The conclave chamber was a circular room at the heart of the ascendants, sealed, shielded, lit by a single ring of white light that cast every face in clinical clarity. 22 seats in a circle, 21 Valesi, and one human woman in the center with a data tablet and a case that was about to fracture their world. Korath was there, composed, treating her presence as a minor inconvenience. Erath was there, silent, watching with those brush-steel eyes. Lyra presented, layer by layer, the phantom maintenance, the ghost workforce, the weapons program, the manufacturing facility, the production timeline. She built the case the way you build a wall, each fact a stone, each connection mortar, the structure growing until it could not be ignored. She spoke clearly, without inflection, without dramatic pauses, without the rhetorical flourishes that Valesi oratory favored. She had considered adopting their style, the measured cadences, the strategic silences, the weighted emphasis on key phrases, and had rejected it. She was not Valesi. She was human. Her strength was not in the performance of authority but in the weight of the evidence, and the evidence did not need performance. It needed precision. She began with the simplest fact, the phantom hull systems, the maintenance expenditures for equipment that did not exist. She displayed the procurement records side by side with the engineering surveys, the gap between the two so wide and so obvious that even a counselor with no financial training could see it. Then she showed the audit protocol modification, the invented directive, the fake exemption, and she could feel the room's attention sharpen the way a blade sharpens when drawn across stone. That was the moment the conclave stopped thinking of her as a curiosity and started thinking of her as evidence. Then she showed the authorization codes, and the room went very still. The chamber listened. Some faces were carved stone, years of political training rendering them unreadable. Others were less controlled. A military commander in the third seat leaned forward incrementally with each new data point, his body language shifting from skepticism to alarm in a gradient Lyra tracked without appearing to. An advisor near Erath's position kept glancing sideways, quick, furtive movements of the eyes that told Lyra she was not the only person in the room who had suspicions about the Communications Oversight Office. Korath's composure held for 12 minutes. It cracked at 14 when she named the weapons facility. It shattered at 18 when she showed production records proving the targeting arrays were already being manufactured. "This is a fabrication," he said. His voice had lost its measured quality, raw now, the voice of someone whose carefully constructed composure had been dismantled in public the way Lyra had dismantled his filing system in private. A human, a species that cannot even read our accounting notation, presenting financial claims about systems she has no authority to access, no standing to interpret, and no qualifications to. "I taught myself your notation," Lyra said. Her voice was steady. She had expected this, had planned for it, had prepared herself the way she prepared for every hostile deposition on Earth, by knowing the data so thoroughly that the challenge became irrelevant. Over the course of 4 months, using a language primer from your education annex and the publicly available administrative manuals in your own archive system, I accessed the procurement records through your own filing protocols, which classify them as administrative rather than financial, a classification your office established. The methodology I used is standard forensic procedure documented by 12 human regulatory bodies and 3 interspecies financial oversight organizations. The data I am presenting has been independently verified by the Empress's own navigation department. She paused to let the room absorb that, then, "Your Radiance," he turned to Savithra. "This human has been manipulated. The data is internally consistent across 14 months of records," Savithra said. Her voice carried the authority of someone who has already made a decision and is allowing the room to arrive at it on their own schedule. "I have verified the methodology with the navigation department, whose systems are not connected to the Treasury network. The numbers are real, Keeper." The room shifted, allegiances recalculating behind 21 pairs of eyes. Furthermore, Commander Davrath has completed a physical inspection of the lower deck sections. He found the manufacturing facility, the targeting arrays, the production records. Korath went white, genuine physiological shock, blood retreating from the surface in the ancestral fear response of a species whose predators had hunted by heat signature. Then Lyra did the thing she had decided at 300 to do, the thing not in her original presentation. "There is a second finding," she said. "The oldest transactions the Foundation laid 3 years ago were not authorized using the Keeper's codes. They were authorized using the personal codes of the late Empress." The room stopped. Not political silence, something deeper, the silence of something sacred being touched. Those codes were used after her death by someone, with biometric access. That access was held by 3 people: the Keeper, Commander Davrath, and the late Empress's physician, Arath. Arath died 7 months later in a shuttle malfunction. The shuttle's navigational data was altered through a routing update from a terminal in the Communications Oversight Office. She did not look at Arath. The room was doing that for her. The update changed the approach vector by 2 degrees, enough to intersect a debris field. The surveillance logs covering the terminal were selectively corrupted, a 12-minute window removed. The corruption was executed through the carrier's communications network. Now she looked at Arath. Arath had not moved, decades of practiced composure. But Lyra had spent 8 months learning to read Valesi micro-expressions, and she saw what Arath could not quite suppress: a tightening of the tendons in her neck, a fractional dilation of her pupils, the smallest shift in her shoulders. "This is outrageous," said Counselor Veleth, seated 3 chairs from Arath. He was old, with papery gray skin and eyes that had seen enough court politics to fill a library. "You are allowing a human to accuse a senior counselor of regicide based on terminal logs and a 2-degree correction." "The construction is the conspiracy," Lyra said. "And the evidence is 14 months of transactions, 3 years of ghost workforce diversions, a manufacturing facility in the lower decks, and a pattern of intimidation directed at every person who has investigated, including a junior clerk whose workstation was compromised last night through the same communications network." Thesson stood. She had been seated along the wall with support staff invisible, as junior clerks were supposed to be. But she stood, held up her personal data chip, and said in a voice that shook but did not break, "I can confirm the access anomalies in the Keeper's system. I have 3 months of independent records. They match the attache's findings exactly." 21 Valesi refocused on another person they had never considered worth seeing. Thesson was young and frightened, and her hands were trembling, and she stood there anyway, because she had been carrying this alone for 3 months and she was done. Erath spoke. Her voice was calm, the cultivated calm of someone who has prepared for this moment. This is a coordinated attack. A human auditor and a disgruntled junior clerk manufacturing evidence to destabilize. Counselor Erath, Savithra said, and her voice was the coldest thing Lyra had ever heard in a room full of stars and silence. You will remain seated. Davrath's security officers entered through both doors simultaneously. The next 3 hours were controlled devastation. Erath denied, demanded counsel, then went silent with the quiet of someone who has realized the game she played for 3 years has ended in a room she thought she controlled. Korath wept, not guilt but the devastated relief of a man learning that the irregularities he had doubted his own sanity over were real, that he had been used, and that the using was done. Thesson testified about the access anomalies she had found, external logins from the communications office masquerading as internal keeper operations. Her voice shook, but her data was clean. Another pair of eyes that had seen what the court refused to see. Lyra answered questions for hours. She laid out the financial architecture for the 3rd time, the 4th, the 5th, each for a different counselor who needed to hear it spoken directly, who needed to watch her face and satisfy themselves that the human woman standing in their sacred chamber was not lying, not confused, not a puppet. One by one, the counselors arrived at the same conclusion. Counselor Velith, who had challenged her most aggressively, was the last. He sat back, closed his eyes, and said quietly, "We have been fools." He was not wrong. The room sat with that verdict for a long, humming moment. The sound of 21 careers and 21 carefully maintained certainties adjusting themselves, slowly and painfully, around a new and deeply uncomfortable truth. When it was over, Savithra dismissed the conclave and asked Lyra to remain. They were alone. The white light cast their shadows on the floor, Savithra's long, Lyra's shorter, both pointing toward the center. "You did not tell me about Erath beforehand," she said. "No." "Why?" "Because if I had told you privately, you would have had to decide whether to act before the conclave saw the evidence. That decision, arresting a senior counselor on the word of a human attache, would have been used against you. The evidence had to land in the open, where every member saw it at the same time, so the conclusion was theirs as much as yours." She was quiet. "You protected me by keeping me in the dark." "I protected the investigation. You happened to be inside it." "That is not entirely true." "No," Lyra admitted, "it is not." Savithra stood and walked to where Lyra was standing. She stopped 2 paces away, close enough that Lyra could see the fine texture of her lavender-gray skin, the luminous lines beneath the surface, and the wet sheen in her amber eyes held with the precision of someone who would not cry because empresses could not afford to. But the woman beneath the title needed to. "Lyra," she said, "not Lyra Voss, not the human attaché, just the name spoken with a gentleness Lyra had not known Veilisi voices could carry. You came to this ship as an afterthought, a curiosity, a forensic auditor from a world my people do not consider worth studying, and in 8 months you saw what my own court refused to see. You built a case my own auditors could not build. You stood in a room full of people who considered you irrelevant and showed them they were wrong about everything." She paused, the wet sheen caught the light. "You traded your anonymity, your safety, your position, everything that protected you for the truth. You could have sold it, buried it, used it for advancement. Instead, you gave it to me." "I considered the advancement option," Lyra said, "for about 30 seconds on the 2nd day." "What changed your mind?" "You asked me why, in the corridor by the viewport, the way you asked, not demanding. You were not an empress looking for a tool. You were a woman looking for the truth about her mother. I decided that was worth more than advancement." Savithra was quiet for a long time. Then she raised her hands, palms up, fingers open, in the veillessy gesture of trust Lyra had learned in her first week and never seen used in person. The old gesture from before the Empire. The one that meant, I am unarmed. I am open. I am choosing to let you see it. Stay, she said, not as an attache, not as a curiosity, as my advisor, my auditor. She paused, reaching across the gap between languages. My person, the one who sees what no one else sees. Lyra looked at her, at the amber eyes holding grief with imperial precision, at the white gold threads catching the light, at the hands held open in a gesture older than either of their civilizations, offered to a human woman who had come to this ship with nothing but a talent for numbers and a stubborn refusal to stop counting. Yes, she said, I will stay. Savithra closed her hands not around Lyra's, but around the space between them, holding it the way you hold something fragile and important, and after a long time in the dark, finally brought into the light. Then we rebuild this court, she said, together. They stood in the white light of the conclave chamber, an empress and an auditor, 7 feet of veillessy elegance, and 5 feet 7 of human stubbornness, separated by 2 paces and bridged by a gesture older than the stars projected on the ceiling of the room where it had all begun. The moment held. Not the dramatic hold of a story reaching its climax, but the quiet hold of 2 people who have been carrying separate weights and have discovered that setting them down in the same place makes both lighter. Lyra did not know, standing in that white-lit chamber, what the rebuilding would look like. She did not know that within a month Erath's network would be fully dismantled, 11 co-conspirators identified through the financial architecture she had mapped. She did not know that Korath would be exonerated and reinstated, and that he would seek her out in the archive room and stand in the doorway for a full minute before saying, quietly, I owe you a debt I do not know how to measure. She did not know that Thesson would be promoted to the audit division, or that she would spend the next year building the independent oversight system Savithra commissioned to ensure no treasury could be drained in silence again. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew the weight of the Empress's gaze and the open architecture of her hands and the feeling, unfamiliar, almost unbearable, of being seen completely by someone who had chosen to look. Outside the sealed walls, the stars burned in the void. In the deep hull, the weapons were being secured and the conspirators questioned. And across the ascendants, from the command deck to the human auxiliary quarters to the archive room, where Lyra had spent 8 months reading numbers in a language she had taught herself, the carrier was beginning to understand that the afterthought they had overlooked had become the most important person on the ship. Not because she had power, not because she had rank, not because she was remarkable in any way their metrics measured. Because she had looked at the numbers when no one else bothered. Because she had taught herself a language no one expected her to learn. Because she had sat in an archive room, quiet and invisible and patient, and she had seen the shape of the thing they were building in the dark. And she had chosen, at the cost of everything that had kept her safe, to bring it into the light. Not for advancement, not anymore. For the woman with the amber eyes who had asked her why and who deserved an answer worth the question. That is what a human does in a veillessy court, not the loudest voice, not the strongest hand, the one who watches, the one who counts, the one who stays when staying costs everything and leaving costs nothing. The one who is, when the ledger is finally balanced enough. And in the constellation chamber, where the stars still turned in their slow projection, and the obsidian floor still held the echo of every footstep that had crossed it, the Empress's throne stood empty for the first time in 2 years. Savithra was not sitting in it. She was standing in the archive room on deck 7, looking at the stacks of data tablets and the handwritten notes and the stolen language primer that had started everything, and she was smiling. The second real smile Lyra had seen from her, small and quiet and aimed at no one in particular. The smile of a woman who had inherited a ship full of secrets and had found, in the last place anyone would have thought to look, someone worth trusting with them.